Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I currently live and work in Texas, but I'm originally from a small town in Middle Georgia, where this story takes place. The events I'm about to share occurred during the summer of 2019, when I was 15 years old. Even now, with the passage of time, I find myself hesitant to share too many specific details about the location. The area contains significant archaeological finds, and the landowner, a private, cautious man named Mr. Hodges, has legitimate concerns about trespassers disturbing the sites or government officials showing up to claim the land. My family's home sat a good distance outside the city limits, surrounded by nothing but dirt roads and dense pine forests extending as far as the eye could see. Our neighbors were scattered and sparse, their properties separated by acres of undeveloped wilderness. The isolation fostered a certain independence in those who lived there, particularly in the children who grew up exploring the woods. Summer in Middle Georgia brings suffocating humidity and fierce thunderstorms, but it also heralds the annual mullet run, when schools of fish migrate upriver from the ocean to spawn. For locals like us, this natural cycle dictated the rhythm of our summer activities. Each year, from late June through August, my father would spend nearly every free moment at a particular sandbar on the Oconee River, fishing rod in hand, waiting for the silver flash of mullet beneath the water's surface. The journey to this fishing spot began where a dirt road ended and a logging trail started. My aunt and uncle's modest farmhouse stood on the left side of this junction, while my cousin Jake lived in a smaller home on the right. The trail meandered through planted pines and ancient hardwoods, eventually opening onto a pristine sandbar that curved alongside the languid river. The land between the houses and the river, over 500 acres of virtually untouched wilderness, belonged to Mr. Hodges. He had worked with my father at the paper mill years earlier, and although they weren't close friends, they shared the easy camaraderie of men who understood hard work. When my father reconnected with him through my uncle, Mr. Hodges granted our family permission to access the river through his property whenever we wished, a generous gesture that shaped my adolescence more profoundly than anyone could have anticipated. My earliest memories of the river blur together in a collage of sensory impressions: the cool slide of mud between my toes, the earthy scent of waterlogged wood, the distant chorus of cicadas that seemed to throb with the heat. I recall watching my father prepare his fishing spot with methodical precision, placing a salt block and mesh bag full of chicken scraps in the middle of the river, secured with metal poles hammered into the riverbed. This bait would attract the mullet overnight, ensuring a productive morning of fishing. The evening before a fishing expedition, our house would buzz with anticipation. My father would organize his tackle, buy night crawlers from the bait shop, and select the perfect river cane for his pole, or purchase a manufactured one if he was feeling, in his words, a little lazy. He'd pack a small cooler with sandwiches and beer, carefully check the weather forecast, and plan to leave just as the eastern sky began to lighten with dawn's first breath. Almost invariably, my mother, my younger brother Brent, and I would accompany him on these excursions. We became intimately familiar with the network of trails that crisscrossed Mr. Hodges's property. When not fishing alongside my father, we'd spend hours exploring on foot or riding four-wheelers along the logging roads, seeking out every mud hole and water crossing. In winter, when the fishing slowed, we'd still visit, breaking inch-thick sheets of ice from the watering holes and testing the limits of our mechanical toys. Sometimes we'd gather with extended family and neighbors, as many as 15 four-wheelers, roaring through the trees before converging at an old shack beside the river to build a bonfire against the night's chill. By 15, I'd already spent years immersed in this landscape, yet I remained ignorant of the darker currents flowing beneath its surface, currents that would eventually pull me into experiences that defied rational explanation and left permanent impressions on my understanding of the natural world and its mysterious boundaries. The Oconee River cuts through central Georgia like a vein, carrying the lifeblood of the region's history within its silty waters. The river bears a name given by the Creek Indians, who once populated its banks, though by the time I was born, their direct descendants had long since been displaced. What remained of their presence lay scattered throughout Mr. Hodges' property, pottery fragments, stone tools, and arrowheads that emerged from the soil after heavy rains like messages from a forgotten time. Mr. Hodges understood the historical significance of these artifacts. Unlike many landowners who might have sought to profit from such discoveries, he preferred to protect them through obscurity. "The government takes what it wants," he once told my father, "and what they don't take, tourists destroy." This philosophy of preservation through isolation applied to the land itself as well as its historical treasures. That summer of 2019, I had developed a passionate interest in the archaeological aspects of the property. While fishing held minimal appeal for me at that age, I lacked the patience required to sit for hours watching a line. The prospect of uncovering tangible connections to the past enthralled me. With my parents' blessing and Mr. Hodges' permission, I would often separate from the family once we reached the sandbar, disappearing into the woods for hours of solitary exploration. My father harbored no worries about these extended absences. "That boy belongs to the woods more than he does to us," he'd tell visitors with a mixture of pride and bemusement. My mother's acquiescence came with conditions. I carried a substantial Bowie knife on my hip, took plenty of water, and promised to return before sunset. No cell phones ventured with me into those woods. Reception was non-existent, and I preferred the disconnection anyway. The property contained several sites of particular interest that I visited regularly. About 2 miles from the sandbar, following the curve of the river, stood what locals called rock houses, shallow caves and overhangs in the limestone bluffs where Native Americans had once sought shelter. The walls of these natural formations bore faint, weather-worn petroglyphs, geometric patterns and stylized animal figures that had withstood centuries of erosion. Further downstream, partially submerged in a narrow section of the river, lay the remains of an indigenous fish trap, an ingenious V-shaped structure of stacked stones designed to funnel swimming fish into a collection area. Though no longer functional, the arrangement of rocks remained visible during periods of low water, testament to the engineering capabilities of people who lived there long before European settlement. These physical remnants fascinated me, but equally compelling were the changes in the forest itself, subtle variations in vegetation that hinted at former clearings where crops might have been cultivated, unusually straight lines of mature trees suggesting intentional planting, circular depressions that might once have been the foundations of structures. The landscape read like a palimpsest, each generation leaving marks that subsequent growth partially obscured but never fully erased. I approached these explorations with reverence rather than acquisition in mind. While many local kids collected arrowheads as curiosities or potential items to sell, I typically left artifacts where I found them after examination. This wasn't due to any explicit instruction, but rather an intuitive sense that removing these objects from their context diminished their significance. The river itself possessed a dual nature, providing sustenance and recreation while simultaneously harboring hidden dangers. Its placid surface concealed strong undertows in certain bends, and the clarity of the water often made depths deceptive. Local lore included accounts of swimmers who had misjudged these hazards with fatal consequences. My father had impressed upon me early the importance of respecting the river's power, teaching me to read its surface patterns and recognize warning signs. During the summer months, the Oconee's main channel remained reasonably navigable, but countless tributary creeks feeding into it could transform from trickling streams to raging torrents within hours after a heavy rainfall in the watershed. These flash floods reshaped the smaller watercourses, exposing new archaeological finds while burying others beneath fresh layers of sediment. It was in one such creek bed, temporarily dry during a mid-July drought, that I made my first significant discovery of that summer, a perfectly preserved clay pot. Small enough to cup in my hands, its exterior decorated with intricate impressed patterns. I photographed it carefully from multiple angles, noted its location, and reluctantly reburied it. The temptation to take it home was strong, but stronger still was my growing conviction that these artifacts belonged to the land itself. The creek bed yielded other treasures over subsequent explorations. Stone pestles worn smooth from grinding grains, pottery shards with distinct rim patterns, and once a ceremonial pipe fragment carved from soapstone. Each discovery deepened my connection to the people who had once called these woods home and fueled my desire to uncover more of their story. As July progressed, I began to venture farther from the familiar trails, mapping new routes in a small notebook I carried. My confidence in navigating the wilderness grew, as did my parents' trust in my self-sufficiency. Yet despite my increasing familiarity with Mr. Hodges' property, certain areas remained unexplored, most notably the northwestern section, where the terrain became more rugged and the forest noticeably denser. Locals rarely mentioned this region specifically, but when they did, their comments carried a subtle undercurrent of caution. My uncle once remarked that it was poor hunting ground, despite the abundant deer tracks visible along its perimeter. Jake, my cousin, more bluntly advised me to stay where the sun can find you when I expressed interest in exploring those deeper woods. At 15, such vague warnings carried little weight against my curiosity. I interpreted their reluctance as adult overprotectiveness, or perhaps territorial instincts, keeping prime exploration grounds for themselves. The northwestern woods beckoned with promises of undiscovered sites and artifacts, their very inaccessibility suggesting reduced chances of prior disturbance. I couldn't have known then how profoundly a single excursion into those avoided reaches would alter my perception of the land I thought I knew, or that some discoveries, once made, cannot be reburied or forgotten, no matter how desperately one might wish to do so. By mid-July, a familiar pattern had established itself. 3 or 4 days each week, my father would announce his intention to visit the river the following morning. Dawn would find our pickup truck bouncing down the rutted dirt road, fishing gear rattling in the bed. We'd park at the trailhead near my uncle's house, unload the equipment and trek the half-mile to the sandbar, arriving just as the morning mist began to lift from the water's surface. My father and brother would settle into the serious business of fishing, while I might swim for an hour or so before growing restless. Then, with a casual wave and a promise to return by late afternoon, I would set off into the woods, my rolled-up jeans and straw hat lending me the appearance of a modern-day Huckleberry Finn. On the morning of July 17, 2019, this routine played out as usual, though with one significant deviation. Before leaving the sandbar, I helped my father place a fresh salt block and replenish the chicken feed in the river. Heavier work than usual due to the summer heat having intensified the growth of algae on the rocks, making them treacherously slippery. After completing this task, I rinsed off in the shallows, allowed myself to dry in the strengthening sun, then pulled on my jeans and prepared to depart. "Don't go getting lost," my father called, his attention already returning to his fishing line. "Never do," I replied, with the casual confidence of youth. My brother Brent, 2 years my junior but already showing promise as an angler, didn't look up from his bobber. "Bring back something cool," he said, referring to my habit of occasionally returning with interesting rocks or unusually shaped pieces of driftwood. I filled my canteen from the cooler, secured my knife sheath to my belt, and set off along the eastern trail, the route I typically took to begin my explorations. The day promised to be brutally hot, with temperatures forecasted to reach the high 90s by afternoon. Already the humid air clung to my skin like a damp cloth. The woods offered some relief from the direct sunlight, though the stillness beneath the canopy trapped the humidity. Cicadas pulsed their metallic chorus from the treetops, punctuated by the occasional cry of a hawk or the rapid drumming of a woodpecker. They moved with the casual confidence of familiarity, barely needing to watch my footing on a path I had traversed dozens of times. About a mile from the sandbar, I veered from my usual route, taking a less-traveled fork that curved northward. This path eventually connected with the dry creek bed where I had previously found the small clay pot, a location I intended to investigate more thoroughly. The going became more difficult as the established trail gave way to animal tracks and game paths, requiring me to push through undergrowth and occasionally climb over fallen trees. As I progressed, I noticed something unusual. Small pebbles occasionally landing near my feet or striking nearby tree trunks with a sharp tap. At first I dismissed these as natural occurrences, perhaps acorns dropping from oak branches or pine cones loosened by squirrels. But the frequency increased as I continued northward, and their trajectories seemed too deliberate for random falls. One struck my shoulder with enough force to sting, causing me to stop and scan the surrounding forest with greater attention. The woods appeared empty of human presence, and I detected no movement beyond the normal stirring of leaves in the intermittent breeze. After a moment's consideration, I continued walking, attributing the phenomenon to some quirk of the landscape or wildlife I didn't yet understand. For nearly 2 hours, I hiked through increasingly unfamiliar terrain, guided partly by the position of the sun and partly by the gentle downward slope that would eventually lead to water. The pebble impacts continued sporadically, never painful, but persistent enough to maintain a low-level awareness of being somehow observed. I reached the now familiar dry creek bed around mid-morning. The drought had worsened since my last visit, exposing more of the stream bed and revealing new potential sites for exploration. I spent an hour carefully examining the exposed soil, finding several pottery fragments, but nothing as significant as the intact vessel I'd discovered earlier. After documenting my findings in my notebook, I decided to follow the creek bed farther upstream than I had previously ventured. This direction would take me northwest, toward the region my relatives had subtly cautioned me to avoid. The rational part of my brain dismissed their warnings as superstition or excessive caution, but some deeper instinct caused me to move with greater alertness, paying closer attention to my surroundings. The creek bed narrowed as it ascended, its banks growing steeper and more densely vegetated. The forest composition gradually shifted from predominantly pine to a greater mixture of hardwoods, mature oaks, hickories, and gnarled sweet gums whose spreading roots often breached the creek's banks. The quality of light changed too, becoming more diffuse and green-tinged as the canopy thickened overhead. About 3 miles from the sandbar, I encountered a natural barrier, a section where the creek bed dropped nearly 3 feet in a small waterfall-like formation. When flowing, this feature would have created a pleasant cascade. But in the current drought, it presented merely a vertical wall of packed clay and embedded stones. Was considering whether to climb this obstacle or turn back when something caught my eye, a glimpse of worked stone partially embedded in the creek bank just below the drop-off. Crouching for a closer look, I realized I was looking at a projectile point, not a common arrowhead, but something larger and more substantial. With careful fingers, I extracted it from the surrounding soil. It was approximately 3 inches long and expertly crafted from a deep purple stone, possibly jasper or a similar material. The point was remarkably intact, showing none of the damage typically found in discarded or lost specimens. Its edges remained sharp enough to demand careful handling, and the base showed the characteristic fluting of Clovis-style points, potentially making it thousands of years old. The discovery filled me with elation. This was by far the most perfect specimen I had ever encountered, its craftsmanship and preservation exceptional. I turned it carefully in my hands, admiring the skill required to shape such resistant material with primitive tools, marveling at the thought that I was the first person to hold this object since its maker had last touched it millennia ago. So absorbed was I in examining this treasure that several moments passed before I became aware of a change in my surroundings. The cicadas had fallen silent. The background rustle of small animals moving through underbrush had ceased. The forest held its breath in a stillness that seemed profoundly unnatural. I looked up from the spearhead, and that's when I saw it. Standing approximately 30 feet away, partially concealed behind the broad trunk of a mature pine, was a figure that defied immediate categorization. My first incoherent thought was that another hiker had wandered into the area, but this impression lasted only a fraction of a second before my brain registered the wrongness of what I was seeing. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, possibly taller, its massive frame dwarfing the surrounding vegetation. From what I could discern, it was covered in coarse, matted hair or fur of a rusty reddish-brown color that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. The build suggested tremendous muscular strength, particularly across the shoulders and chest, tapering to a narrower waist and long, powerful limbs. But it was the face that arrested my attention most completely, a countenance that seemed simultaneously human and not human. The features were arranged in recognizable proportions, but appeared weathered and ancient, the skin leathery and deeply lined. Beneath heavy brow ridges, eyes regarded me with unmistakable intelligence and awareness. Those eyes disrupted any attempt to classify this as a known animal. They weren't the dull, instinct-driven gaze of a bear or other large mammal, but windows to a consciousness that evaluated and considered. When a shaft of sunlight momentarily illuminated them, they reflected a peculiar greenish-gold color that reminded me of a predator's eyeshine, though with a quality entirely different from any wildlife I had encountered. The moment stretched between us, neither moving nor speaking. No threatening gesture came from the figure. It simply observed me with what I can only describe as intense curiosity. I remained frozen in place, the spearhead still clutched in my hand, my breathing shallow and controlled, despite the hammering of my heart. Time became elastic and unreliable. What might have been 10 seconds felt like minutes as we regarded each other across that small clearing. The surrounding forest maintained its unnatural silence, as though all other creatures held their breath alongside me. Then, acting on an impulse I cannot fully explain, I slowly crouched down and placed the purple spearhead exactly where I had found it, pressing it gently back into the soil of the creek bank. My eyes never left the figure as I performed this action. The response was subtle but unmistakable. A slight inclination of the massive head, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement or perhaps approval. Then, with a deliberateness that suggested neither fear nor aggression, the figure turned away from me and moved deeper into the forest. Its movement contradicted what I might have expected from such a large, seemingly ponderous being. It navigated the dense undergrowth with fluid grace, making less noise than a deer would have in similar terrain. Blackberry thickets and tangled vines that would have impeded a human seemed to part before it, closing again in its wake. I remained motionless, watching until the figure disappeared from sight, then listening as the sounds of its passage gradually faded. Only when I could no longer detect any indication of its presence did I become aware that I had been holding my breath. The exhalation came as a shuddering release, accompanied by a delayed reaction of trembling in my limbs that made standing difficult. The forest around me gradually reanimated. Birdsong resumed, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The background hum of insects returned. Whatever temporary spell had descended over the natural world had lifted, leaving behind only the ordinary sounds of a summer day in the woods. I glanced down at the spearhead, still visible where I had returned it to the soil. A powerful urge to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this location, competed with my scholarly interest in the artifact. After a moment's internal struggle, I decided to leave it untouched. Something about the interaction suggested that returning the object had been the right decision, and I was reluctant to disturb whatever equilibrium had been established. With a final look around the clearing, I turned and began making my way back downstream, retracing my path toward more familiar territory. My pace was measured rather than panicked. I had an instinctive sense that running would be somehow inappropriate or even dangerous in this situation. As I walked, I tried to process what I had witnessed, cycling through possible explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs. No bear moved with such bipedal fluidity or possessed that facial structure. Some unknown species of great ape? Georgia's ecosystem supported no such creatures. A human in some kind of costume or disguise. The authenticity of the being's presence defied such artificial explanation. The only conclusion that approached coherence was one I hesitated to articulate even in the privacy of my own thoughts, that I had encountered something akin to what folklore called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Yet even this label seemed insufficient to encompass the intelligence and awareness I had perceived in those eyes. I continued homeward with a strange mixture of fear and wonder. By the time I reached the sandbar where my father and brother still fished, the experience had taken on a dreamlike quality that made me question whether it had happened at all. The familiar sight of their figures, the ordinary sounds of splashing water and casual conversation grounded me in normalcy that made the morning's events seem increasingly improbable. "Catch anything good?" I asked, my voice sounding surprisingly steady to my own ears. My father looked up, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Dozen or so. Your brother pulled in a 5-pounder. He studied my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Heat getting to you?" I shook my head. "Just tired. Walked farther than usual." This answer seemed to satisfy him. He returned his attention to his fishing line, and I settled onto the sandbar, grateful for the uncomplicated company and the opportunity to collect my thoughts. That evening, back at home, I considered telling my family about the encounter, but ultimately decided against it. The experience felt too personal, too potentially disbelieved to share immediately. Instead, I lay awake long into the night, replaying the scene in my mind, searching for details I might have missed or misinterpreted. One aspect continued to puzzle me: the pebbles that had struck near me throughout my hike. In retrospect, their trajectory and timing suggested deliberate tosses rather than natural falls. Had the being been following me, perhaps even attempting to communicate in some primitive fashion? The thought should have been terrifying, yet somehow it wasn't. Whatever I had encountered had displayed no aggression, only watchful interest. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my racing thoughts, and I fell into a dreamless sleep. But the experience had fundamentally altered something in my perception of the world, reshaping the boundaries between what I understood to be possible and impossible, known and unknown. The woods I had explored since childhood suddenly contained depths I had never suspected, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would return to seek further understanding. The week following my encounter passed in a fog of distraction. I went through the motions of daily life, helping with chores, watching television with my family, even accompanying my father on another fishing trip. But my thoughts continuously circled back to what I had seen in the northwestern woods. The image of that towering figure remained vivid in my memory, refusing to fade or distort as dreams typically do. I found myself researching cryptozoology and Bigfoot sightings on our home computer, reading accounts from across the country with new interest. Many seemed exaggerated or implausible, but certain details resonated with my experience: the intelligence in the eyes, the fluid movement through difficult terrain, the sense of being observed rather than threatened. None of the photographs or sketches I found accurately captured what I had seen, though. They depicted something more bestial and less aware than the being in the woods. My mother noticed my preoccupation. Summer boredom setting in? She asked one evening as I pushed food around my plate at dinner. Just thinking about a book I'm reading, I lied. Uncomfortable with deception, but more uncomfortable with attempting to explain what actually occupied my thoughts. By the following Tuesday, I had resolved to return to the northwestern section of the property. My father had no plans to fish that day, but at breakfast I announced my intention to hike to the river regardless. "Taking your fishing pole?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "No, sir, just exploring." He nodded, familiar with my independent tendencies. "Be back before dark. Storms in the forecast for tonight." I packed more thoroughly than usual. Extra water, protein bars, a small first aid kit, a compass, and a disposable camera I had purchased specifically for this expedition. I neither expected nor particularly hoped to photograph the being I had encountered, but having the camera provided a sense of purpose and potential documentation. The hike to the creek bed followed the same route as before, though this time I moved with greater deliberation, pausing frequently to study my surroundings. About a mile into the journey, I noticed the first pebble striking a tree trunk to my right. Rather than ignoring it as I had previously, I stopped and turned toward the source of the projectile. "I know you're there," I said aloud, feeling simultaneously foolish and exhilarated. "I'm not here to cause any harm." No response came. No movement betrayed a presence in the underbrush, but when I resumed walking, the pebbles ceased temporarily. This pattern repeated several times throughout my hike. Periods of pebble throwing, followed by silence when I acknowledged the action verbally. I reached the dry creek bed by mid-morning and continued upstream toward the site of my previous encounter. The spearhead remained exactly where I had replaced it, partially embedded in the soil. I crouched to examine it, but made no move to touch it this time. "I left it here for you," I said to the seemingly empty forest. "It belongs here, not in someone's collection." The words felt right as I spoke them, though I had not planned this speech in advance. Something about the artifact's perfection and historical significance demanded respect that transcended personal ownership. For nearly an hour, I sat beside the creek bed, occasionally speaking aloud thoughts about the forest, the archaeological sites, and my appreciation for being allowed to explore them. I consciously avoided direct references to my previous encounter, framing my monologue as though addressing the land itself rather than any specific entity. Eventually, I unwrapped a protein bar and ate it slowly, watching a pair of cardinals flit between branches overhead. The forest felt alive but unthreatening, the silence comfortable rather than ominous. When I had finished eating, I carefully packed the wrapper away and rose to continue exploring upstream. Beyond the small waterfall formation, the creek bed narrowed further, its course winding between rock outcroppings that suggested geological forces far older than human habitation. I moved carefully, photographing interesting formations and making notes in my journal. About a quarter-mile beyond my previous stopping point, I discovered a small clearing beside the creek bed, a roughly circular space where the canopy opened slightly to admit more direct sunlight. What caught my attention was not the clearing itself, but what lay within it. Carefully arranged stones forming a pattern too deliberate to be natural. The stones, ranging from fist-size to small boulders, formed 3 concentric circles with a larger, flat stone at the center. Between the circles, smaller stones created what appeared to be rays or spokes connecting the rings. The entire arrangement measured perhaps 12 feet in diameter, with the central stone elevated slightly above the surrounding ground. My first thought was that I had discovered another indigenous structure, perhaps ceremonial in nature. I approached cautiously, camera ready, and began documenting the formation from various angles. Only as I circled it did I notice something odd. The lichen growing on the stones appeared relatively fresh, suggesting the arrangement was far newer than pre-colonial times. I was contemplating this discrepancy when movement at the clearing's edge caught my eye. There, partially obscured by a thicket of mountain laurel, stood the being I had encountered before. This time, my reaction contained less shock and more wonder. I lowered the camera slowly, instinctively understanding that attempting to photograph the creature would be inappropriate or possibly provocative. We regarded each other across the stone circles, neither advancing nor retreating. In daylight, with a clearer view, I could observe more details of the being's appearance. The reddish-brown hair covered most of its body, but thinned somewhat on the face, revealing skin that appeared weathered and darkly tanned. The facial features suggested neither male nor female in human terms, but conveyed a maturity and weathering that implied great age. Most striking were the hands, large but distinctly hand-like, with opposable thumbs and fingers that appeared capable of fine manipulation. One such hand now rose in what seemed a deliberate gesture, not threatening, but communicative. Palm forward with fingers slightly spread. Without fully understanding my own impulse, I mirrored the gesture, raising my hand in similar fashion. The being held this position for several seconds, then slowly lowered its arm. I did the same. What followed was a wordless interaction that lasted perhaps 5 minutes. The being would make a gesture, pointing to the stone arrangement, then to the surrounding trees, then to itself, and pause, as though conveying information. I would nod or occasionally respond with my own gestures, feeling as though I was participating in a conversation whose syntax remained just beyond my comprehension. Eventually, the being made a sweeping motion toward the western horizon, where darkening clouds suggested the approach of the predicted storm system. Then it looked directly at me and repeated the gesture with greater emphasis. The meaning seemed clear, a warning about the weather, an advisement to return to safety before the storm arrived. I nodded my understanding and gathered my backpack, preparing to depart. Before leaving, I turned toward the stone arrangement and made a small bow, an improvised sign of respect for whatever significance it held. When I looked up, the being had already retreated several yards into the forest. It paused, visible only as a darker shadow among the trees, then continued moving with that same fluid grace I had observed previously, disappearing into the depths of the woods. The return journey passed without incident, though I noticed dark clouds building more rapidly than expected. About a mile from the trailhead, large raindrops began to penetrate the canopy, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I increased my pace, reaching my uncle's house just as the storm broke in earnest. My uncle was on his porch, watching the approaching weather. "Cutting it close," he observed as I jogged up his driveway. "Your dad called. Said to tell you to wait here if the rain caught you." I nodded, grateful for the shelter and the chance to gather my thoughts before returning home. As we sat watching the downpour, my uncle seemed to study me with unusual intensity. "You been exploring up northwest?" he asked casually, though something in his tone suggested the question held greater significance. I hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir. Following the dry creek that runs up that way." He nodded slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Find anything interesting?" "Some stone formations," I replied cautiously. "Looked man-made." He sipped from a mug of coffee. "That land's got history. More than most folks know or talk about." I waited, sensing he had more to say, but he lapsed into silence, watching the rain bend the branches of nearby pines. After several minutes he spoke again, his voice lower. "Best to leave things as you find them out there. Show respect." His eyes met mine. "The woods notice how you treat them." The phrasing sent a chill through me despite the summer heat. Before I could formulate a response, he stood and stretched. "Rain's letting up. I'll drive you home in the truck." The conversation ended there, but his words lingered in my mind long afterward, carrying implications I was only beginning to understand. The storm that had cut short my expedition lingered over the region for 3 days, dropping nearly 7 inches of rain and causing localized flooding. The Oconee River rose 4 feet above its normal summer level, transforming the gentle current into a churning, debris-laden flow that made fishing impossible. I used this enforced break from outdoor exploration to organize my thoughts and research. On Wednesday afternoon, when my parents and brother had gone into town for groceries, I visited our local library to investigate the historical records of the area, specifically focusing on indigenous settlements and any unusual reports from early European settlers. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly librarian who had known me since I was a toddler, seemed surprised by my sudden interest in local history, but directed me to the relevant section without questioning my motives. The collection was modest, but included several locally published volumes documenting the region's development. In early settlements of Baldwin County, I found brief mentions of the Creek and Cherokee peoples who had inhabited the Oconee River Basin before being forcibly relocated during the 1830s. One passage particularly caught my attention. Traders and early missionaries reported that certain areas along the river were considered sacred or restricted by indigenous populations. One such location, described as lying where the water falls twice before joining the main flow, was said to be protected by guardian spirits who would punish trespassers. Such beliefs were dismissed by settlers as superstition designed to protect hunting grounds or valuable resources. The description, where the water falls twice, could potentially match the section of creek I'd been exploring, which contained two small waterfall formations before joining the river. I continued reading with increased interest. Another volume, Folklore of Central Georgia, contained a chapter on unexplained phenomena reported by settlers and later residents. Most accounts were typical ghost stories or exaggerated tales of natural events. But one entry from 1891 stood out. H. Blackwood, a surveyor mapping timber resources, reported encountering a man-like creature of excessive stature and primitive appearance while working in the northwestern forests of the county. Blackwood described the being as covered in reddish hair and possessing eyes that bespoke intelligence rather than animal nature. When colleagues investigated the location, they found only unusual footprints and broken branches at a height impossibly tall for a man to reach. The account continued, noting that Blackwood became reluctant to discuss the incident after facing ridicule, eventually attributing his experience to exhaustion and possible sunstroke. However, the author observed that several logging operations in the area were subsequently abandoned under unclear circumstances, with workers citing equipment damage and general unease. I carefully copied these passages into my notebook, noting the striking similarities to my own experiences. The research provided context that both validated my encounters and deepened their mystery, suggesting that whatever I had seen was not only real, but had been interacting with humans in the region for generations. When the rain finally ceased on Friday morning, the forest remained too waterlogged for comfortable exploration. By Saturday, however, conditions had improved enough for my father to suggest another fishing trip, noting that the high water might bring different species within reach. I agreed readily, eager to return to the river, though my motivations had shifted from archaeological interests to the hope of another encounter with the forest being. We arrived at the sandbar around 8 o'clock, finding it partially submerged by the elevated water level. Debris from upstream, branches, leaves, and occasionally entire logs floated past at a concerning speed. "River's angry today," my father observed, setting up his equipment on higher ground. "Stay clear of the deep water if you go wandering." I promised caution and helped him secure his gear before setting off. Rather than taking my usual route, I followed the riverbank downstream, intending to circle back toward the northwestern section via a different approach. The recent flooding had transformed the landscape, exposing roots and reshaping the shoreline. In several places, freshly fallen trees created obstacles that required careful navigation. About a mile downstream, I discovered something unexpected, a section of bank that had collapsed entirely, revealing a stratified cross-section of soil and embedded objects. Archaeological sites created by erosion are not uncommon along rivers, But the clarity of this exposure was remarkable. I approached carefully, mindful of the unstable ground, and examined the vertical face of exposed earth. Distinct layers marked different periods of deposition, the darkest containing charcoal fragments suggesting human habitation. Embedded within this layer were numerous artifacts, pottery shards, stone tools, and what appeared to be bone fragments, possibly from food preparation. What captured my attention most forcefully, however, was a horizontal line of unusual stones set into the soil about 4 feet below the surface. Each stone, there were 7 visible in the exposure, had been worked into a roughly cylindrical shape with a hollow center, creating something like stone beads approximately 2 inches in diameter. They had been placed side by side in what was clearly a deliberate arrangement, rather than a random deposit. I photographed the exposure carefully, then extracted my notebook to sketch the arrangement. As I worked, I became aware of a familiar sensation, the subtle impact of small pebbles landing nearby. Looking up, I scanned the surrounding forest, but saw nothing unusual amid the dripping foliage. "I see you," I said quietly. "Or at least, I know you're there." No response came, but the pebble throwing ceased. I returned to my documentation, working methodically to record the site before continuing my journey. When I had finished, I gathered my belongings and stood, addressing the invisible watcher once more. "Thank you for showing me these things. I won't disturb them." As I moved away from the riverbank and deeper into the forest, the sense of being observed intensified. Unlike my previous experiences, this awareness carried no threat or unease. Rather, it felt like being accompanied by a silent companion who remained just out of sight. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, or hear the subtle sounds of passage through underbrush, always at a distance that maintained separation without abandonment. My path gradually curved northward, following game trails that showed recent use. After approximately 2 hours of hiking, I recognized landmarks that indicated I was approaching the creek bed I had previously explored, though from a different direction than before. The forest in this area showed signs of the recent flooding, silt deposits on lower tree trunks, debris caught in branches several feet above the ground, and deeply carved channels where runoff had sought the lowest path. When I reached the creek itself, I found it transformed from a dry bed to a vigorous stream flowing with silty brown water. The small waterfall formations had become active cascades, their sound filling the otherwise quiet forest. I followed the now flowing creek upstream, moving more carefully on the slippery banks. Upon reaching the clearing with the stone circles, I discovered significant changes. The flooding had partially rearranged the outermost circle, displacing several stones and covering others with silt. What surprised me, however, was that the inner circles remained perfectly intact, suggesting someone had reassembled or protected them after the waters receded. More striking still was a new addition at the center. Atop the flat central stone now sat a carefully balanced tower of smaller stones, a cairn of the type sometimes used as trail markers, though this one appeared more deliberately artistic in its construction. The stones decreased in size as the tower rose, with the topmost being no larger than a marble. As I stood contemplating this change, a distinctive sound reached me from across the clearing, a series of clicks or knocks that seemed to arise from solid objects being struck together. The pattern contained evident structure: 3 quick knocks, a pause, 2 knocks, a longer pause, then 3 knocks again. Without conscious thought, I found myself responding, picking up a fallen branch and striking it against a nearby tree in the same pattern. 3, 2, 3. The forest fell silent for several heartbeats after my response. Then, from a different direction, the pattern repeated, slightly varied. 3, 2, 2. I mimicked this change in my response. What followed was the strangest conversation of my life, a wordless exchange of percussive signals that continued for nearly 10 minutes. The patterns grew more complex, sometimes incorporating different tones or volumes, and I struggled to replicate them accurately. Yet there seemed to be a patience in the exchange, a willingness to repeat sequences when my reproduction failed to match the original. Eventually, a final pattern sounded, a complex rhythm that I could not hope to imitate. When I made no response, a simpler sequence followed, 313. This I managed to reproduce. Then silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of the flowing creek and distant bird calls. I waited, sensing that the exchange had concluded, at least for now, as I prepared to depart, acting on an impulse I didn't fully understand. I approached the stone arrangement and carefully added a small stone of my own to the cairn at its center. The action felt significant, an acknowledgement of participation perhaps, or simple gratitude for the interaction. My return journey to the sandbar followed a more direct route than my approach had taken. Throughout the hike, I remained aware of being watched, though the pebble throwing did not resume. It was as though, having established a different form of communication, this method had become unnecessary. I reached my father and brother in the late afternoon, finding them packing up their gear with satisfied expressions that suggested a successful day's fishing. Neither commented on my mud-spattered appearance or the thoughtful silence I maintained during the drive home. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the knocking patterns in my mind, trying to discern meaning or structure within them. Were they a language, a test, simply an attempt to establish connection? Whatever their purpose, I felt certain the exchange represented a significant development in my relationship with the being in the woods, a shift from observation to interaction that carried both exhilaration and a subtle undercurrent of concern about where such communication might lead. The remainder of July passed in a blur of similar expeditions. Each time my family visited the river, I would separate from them to explore the northwestern woods, gradually mapping a wider territory and documenting additional sites of interest. The being, whom I had begun to think of simply as the Watcher, maintained a consistent presence during these explorations, though direct sightings remained rare. Our communication evolved into a peculiar rhythm. The pebble tossing continued as a form of initial contact or attention-getting, while the knocking patterns emerged in specific locations, particularly near the stone circles or other apparently significant sites. I began experimenting with initiating these exchanges rather than merely responding, and occasionally received answers to my overtures. By early August, I'd compiled a small catalogue of knocking patterns and their apparent contexts, noting that certain sequences seemed to correspond to specific locations or times of day. The 323 pattern, for instance, frequently occurred near water, while a more complex 5312 sequence typically sounded near ridgetops or elevated positions. What remained unclear was whether these constituted a true language or merely signaling behaviors. The distinctions seemed important. One suggested a level of cognitive complexity approaching or exceeding human capacity, while the other, though still remarkable, might represent a more instinctive form of territorial marking or warning system. On August 7th, having exhausted my father's patience for fishing excursions, I convinced my cousin Jake to drive me to the trailhead, claiming I wanted to photograph wildlife along the river. He agreed reluctantly, extracting a promise that I would remain within shouting distance of the sandbar. This promise I promptly broke once his truck disappeared down the dirt road. Instead of heading toward the river, I struck out directly northwest, following what had become a familiar route to the stone circle clearing. My pack contained not only my usual supplies, but also a small audio recorder I had purchased specifically to document the knocking patterns. The day was slightly cooler than previous weeks, with high clouds tempering the August sun and a gentle breeze stirring the forest canopy. I moved with the confidence of familiarity, recognizing landmarks and anticipating changes in terrain. The creek had receded to a more typical summer flow, allowing easier passage along its banks. Upon reaching the stone circle clearing, I found it unoccupied, but showing signs of recent activity. The central cairn had been reconstructed since my last visit, now incorporating small objects between some of the stones, a blue jay feather, a fragment of quartz crystal, and what appeared to be a small piece of worked flint. I set up the recorder on a flat rock at the clearing's edge, activating it before announcing my presence with a now familiar knocking pattern, 3-2-3. No immediate response came, so I settled cross-legged near the center of the circle and waited, occasionally repeating the signal at intervals of approximately 5 minutes. After nearly an hour of silence, I began to wonder if my unseen companion was absent or perhaps deliberately avoiding this encounter. As I was considering whether to relocate, a different sound reached me, not the expected knocks, but a low, modulated vocalization from somewhere in the surrounding forest. The sound defied easy description. It contained elements reminiscent of whale song, sustained tones that rose and fell in pitch, combined with guttural resonances, unlike any human voice I had heard. The vocalization lasted perhaps 15 seconds before fading into silence. I sat motionless, heart racing, aware that this represented a significant escalation in our communication. After several minutes of silence, I responded the only way I could imagine, with a simple hummed melody, the first few notes of a folk song my grandmother had taught me years earlier. The forest absorbed my offering without immediate response. Then, just as I began to think no answer would come, the vocalization returned, this time clearly attempting to mimic the pattern of notes I had produced, though in a register far deeper than any human could generate, and with tonal qualities that remained distinctly non-human. What followed was an exchange similar to our previous knocking conversations, but infinitely more complex. I would produce simple melodies, and the unseen being would reproduce them with varying degrees of accuracy, sometimes adding elements that seemed to represent interpretations or extensions of the original pattern. This sonic dialogue continued for perhaps 20 minutes, during which I remained acutely aware of the recorder capturing every moment. Despite my excitement, I maintained a calm exterior, moving slowly when necessary and avoiding sudden gestures that might appear threatening. Eventually, a rustling in the underbrush announced a more direct approach. From the eastern edge of the clearing, partially concealed by the low branches of a hemlock, emerged the now familiar figure of the Watcher, in full daylight, standing at the clearing's edge without the concealment of distance or shadow. The being's appearance was both more and less human than in previous encounters. The proportions of limbs to torso followed a recognizably humanoid pattern, but scaled to dimensions that exceeded normal human range. The hands, now clearly visible as they parted branches, possessed distinct fingers and opposable thumbs, though the digits appeared longer and more powerful than human equivalents. The face, partially visible beneath a heavy brow ridge, contained features arranged in familiar positions: eyes, nose, mouth, but with proportions that suggested evolutionary divergence rather than deformity. The eyes, set deeper than human norm, reflected intelligence and what I can only describe as a profound age that transcended individual lifespan. For several minutes, the being remained at the clearing's edge, alternating its gaze between me and the recorder still running on the nearby rock. Then, with deliberate movements, it approached the stone circles, moving to the opposite side from my position, but remaining within the outermost ring. At this distance, perhaps 15 feet, communication felt almost tangible. The being produced another vocalization, shorter than before, but more complex in its modulation. When it finished, one long arm extended toward me, palm up, in what appeared to be an inviting gesture. I hesitated, unsure of the appropriate response. Then, moving slowly, I extended my own arm, mirroring the gesture, but not approaching closer. This appeared to satisfy whatever exchange was being offered, as the being lowered its arm and produced a series of softer vocalizations that suggested approval or acknowledgement. What happened next remains difficult to explain without sounding fanciful. The being crouched beside the central cairn and with surprising dexterity rearranged several of the stones. Then it selected a new stone from the ground nearby, a flat oval river rock, and placed it at the top of the structure. With one finger, it traced a pattern on the stone's surface, a series of intersecting lines that resembled crude writing or perhaps a map. When it had finished, it looked directly at me and then at the recorder before making a sharp, clearly negative vocalization. The meaning seemed unmistakable. This exchange was not to be recorded. I nodded my understanding and moved slowly to retrieve the device, switching it off with a demonstrative gesture. This appeared to satisfy the being, who returned to manipulating the stones in the central cairn. For the next hour, we engaged in a form of communication that transcended conventional understanding. Through gestures, arrangements of objects, vocalizations, and occasional direct mimicry, information was exchanged, though the content remained frustratingly opaque in many instances. What became increasingly clear, however, was that this being possessed knowledge of the land that extended far beyond simple territorial awareness. At one point, it created a rough map in the dirt, indicating with remarkable accuracy the course of the river, the location of major trails, and what appeared to be underground features not visible on the surface. When it indicated a particular location on this map, a point perhaps 2 miles northeast of our current position, and made an emphatic gesture of digging, followed by a warning vocalization, I interpreted this as identifying a dangerous or significant subsurface feature. The location corresponded roughly with an area local hunters avoided due to unexplained equipment failures and disorientation. As the afternoon progressed, our interaction developed a rhythm of exchange that felt almost conversational despite the absence of shared language. I would indicate curiosity about a feature on the improvised map, and the being would respond with gestures or vocalizations that conveyed additional information, sometimes accompanied by pantomimed warnings or approvals. Eventually, the angle of sunlight filtering through the canopy indicated approaching evening. The being seemed to notice this simultaneously with me, glancing skyward before beginning what felt like a concluding interaction. It dismantled the cairn with careful movements, returning each stone to a specific position within the larger circle arrangement. The blue jay feather it handed to me directly, an offering I accepted with a small bow of acknowledgement. Then, with a final vocalization that somehow conveyed both farewell and continuity, it retreated to the forest edge. Before disappearing completely into the undergrowth, it paused to look back, a gesture so humanly recognizable that it momentarily collapsed the sense of otherness that had defined our interaction. I remained in the clearing until certain of the being's departure, then gathered my belongings and began the return journey. The recorder in my pack represented a treasure of potential evidence, though I already harbored doubts about sharing it with others. Something about the interaction had established a sense of mutual trust that public disclosure would violate. My cousin was waiting at the trailhead, his expression indicating annoyance at my later-than-promised return. "Find anything worth photographing?" he asked as I climbed into his truck. "More than I expected," I replied truthfully, though I offered no elaboration. Later that night, listening to the recording in the privacy of my room, I was simultaneously elated and disturbed by what I heard. The vocalizations were clearly present, undeniable evidence of something beyond conventional explanation. Yet they seemed somehow diminished when removed from the context of direct experience, reduced to curious audio phenomena that skeptics could easily attribute to known animals or technical anomalies. More importantly, I felt increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of sharing this evidence. The being had clearly indicated opposition to being recorded, and though it couldn't have understood the technology's full implications, the preference for privacy had been unmistakable. After several days of internal debate, I made a decision that might seem irrational to outside observers, but felt ethically necessary. I erased the recording, choosing to preserve the encounter in memory and personal notes rather than as potential scientific evidence. Some relationships, I had come to believe, transcended the human impulse to catalogue and classify. As August waned and the prospect of returning to school loomed, I intensified my explorations, aware that each might be the last of the season. My parents, noticing my increasing preoccupation with the woods, expressed mild concern about my extended absences, but stopped short of imposing restrictions. "Just make sure you're ready for school," my mother cautioned as I packed for yet another solo expedition. "Your sophomore year matters for college applications." I promised to maintain my academic focus once the school year began, a commitment I fully intended to honor. But these final weeks of summer freedom felt precious beyond measure, offering opportunities for understanding that I sensed might not come again with the same clarity. On August 20th, during what I expected might be my final extended exploration before school resumed, I returned to the area the Watcher had indicated on its improvised map. The location accompanied by digging gestures and warning vocalizations. My curiosity about this site had intensified rather than diminished in the intervening weeks. The area lay in a shallow depression approximately 2 miles northeast of the Stone Circle clearing. Unlike much of the surrounding forest, this section contained almost exclusively deciduous trees, mature oaks and hickories, whose broad canopies created a cathedral-like atmosphere beneath. The ground showed subtle irregularities that might have been dismissed as natural variations, but, to my now experienced eye, suggested ancient human manipulation, perhaps the remains of structures or ceremonial earthworks long reclaimed by nature. I spent several hours conducting a systematic survey of the depression, noting soil coloration changes and vegetation patterns that might indicate subsurface features. Near the center of the area, I discovered what appeared to be a collapsed sinkhole, a roughly circular depression approximately 8 feet in diameter where the ground had subsided. Approaching this feature cautiously, I detected a subtle current of cooler air emerging from small fissures around its perimeter, suggesting connection to underground spaces. When I placed my ear near one such opening, I could hear the faint sound of water movement far below. The Watcher's warning gesture now made more sense. This area likely contained extensive cave systems or underground waterways that could pose serious dangers to anyone attempting excavation or even walking carelessly across the thin surface crust. As I documented the site in my notebook, I became aware of the now familiar sense of being observed. Looking up, I was unsurprised to find the Watcher standing at the depression's edge, partially concealed by a massive oak, but making no particular effort to hide its presence. We acknowledged each other with what had become our customary gestures, a raised hand, palm forward, briefly extended before being lowered. The being then approached, moving with its characteristic fluid grace despite the uneven terrain. Upon reaching the collapsed sinkhole, it knelt and placed one large hand flat against the ground, remaining motionless for several seconds as though feeling for vibrations or other sensory information. Then it looked at me and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire depression before pointing downward and producing a low, warning vocalization. I nodded my understanding. "There's something dangerous under here. A cave system, maybe?" The being couldn't understand my words, of course, but seemed to grasp my comprehension of the warning. It rose and made a more specific gesture, pointing to the ground, then to its eyes, then making a circular motion with one finger before pointing to its head. The sequence concluded with a negative gesture, a sharp, sideways movement of the hand that clearly indicated prohibition or danger. Interpreted this as a warning about disorientation or confusion, perhaps gases in the caves below that could affect perception or consciousness. "People get lost down there," I suggested. "Or the air makes them sick." The being repeated the negative gesture with greater emphasis, then added a new element, placing both hands beside its head and mimicking what appeared to be sleep or unconsciousness. "It kills people," I concluded. "The air or something down there is deadly." This interpretation appeared to satisfy the being, who nodded in what seemed remarkably human affirmation. Then it gestured for me to follow and moved away from the sinkhole toward the depression's eastern edge. I followed at a respectful distance, curious about this unprecedented invitation. The being led me approximately 200 yards to a massive fallen oak whose root system had torn free of the earth, creating a natural wall of soil and tangled roots. Here it stopped and pointed to a specific section of the exposed root mass. Initially, I saw nothing significant, just the expected tangle of woody roots and clinging soil. Then, as I looked more carefully, I noticed something unnatural embedded among the roots, white objects with unmistakably regular shapes. Moving closer, I realized with a shock that I was looking at human bones, a partial skeleton, including what appeared to be a rib cage and several long bones, presumably arms or legs. The remains had been within the root system for considerable time, as smaller roots had grown through and around the bones, securing them within the tangled mass. The being watched my reaction carefully, then made a series of gestures indicating the sinkhole area, followed by the sleeping motion and finally pointing to the bones. The meaning seemed clear. These remains represented a victim of whatever hazard lurked beneath the forest floor. The discovery raised immediate questions about proper reporting of human remains, but also concerns about protecting both the archaeological sites and the Watcher itself from the intrusion that would inevitably follow official investigation. I stood motionless, processing these conflicting obligations. The being seemed to sense my dilemma. It made another gesture, pointing to the bones, then to the earth, then making a covering motion with both hands. Then it looked at me questioningly. "You want me to rebury them?" I asked, though I knew the words themselves meant nothing to my companion. "To leave them undisturbed?" The being repeated the covering gesture, then added a new element, pointing to itself, then making a circular motion that encompassed the entire forest before touching its chest. I interpreted this as expressing some form of responsibility or stewardship for the area. After careful consideration, I nodded agreement. The remains appeared old, possibly decades rather than years, and disturbing them would lead to investigations that might threaten both the archaeological treasures and the being itself. While I recognized the ethical complexity of the decision, I felt that respecting the being's evident role as guardian of this place took precedence over conventional protocols. We worked together in an unexpected collaboration, the being using its greater strength to reposition the larger sections of root mass while I carefully covered the exposed bones with soil. When the task was complete, the site appeared natural once more. The human remains hidden, but not disturbed from their resting place. As we finished, the being made a new gesture, touching its chest, then pointing to me, then sweeping its arm to include the surrounding forest before bringing its hands together in what appeared to be a symbol of connection or alliance. The meaning felt profound, an acknowledgement of shared responsibility for protecting this place and its secrets. I mirrored the gesture, feeling the weight of this unspoken agreement. We had transcended the initial curiosity and caution that had characterized our early encounters, establishing something that, despite our profound differences, resembled mutual trust. The being nodded once more, then turned and moved away into the forest with its characteristic silent efficiency. I remained for several minutes, committing the location to memory while recognizing that I would mark it on no map and share its coordinates with no authority. Some discoveries I had learned carry responsibilities that transcend conventional obligations. My final weeks of summer passed without further direct encounters, though I continued to explore the accessible areas of Mr. Hodges's property. The pebble-tossing and occasional distant knocking patterns persisted, assuring me of the Watcher's continued presence But our paths did not directly cross again before school resumed in early September. When my sophomore year began, I found myself drawn back to the library, now researching with greater purpose. Historical accounts of the region revealed additional context for what I had experienced. Mentions in early settlers' journals of guardian spirits in certain forests, mysterious protectors who seemed to watch over both the land and the indigenous peoples who understood their nature. One missionary's account from 1792 included a passage that resonated particularly strongly with my experiences. The natives speak of forest beings who stand as guardians of sacred places. They describe these entities as resembling men of great stature, covered in hair, who communicate through sounds and signs rather than speech. When questioned about worshipping such creatures, the elders explained that these were not gods, but rather ancient stewards of the land who had watched over it since before human memory. They leave offerings at certain stone arrangements to maintain peaceful relations with these guardians, and in return, receive protection and guidance regarding dangerous places within their territories. This account, largely dismissed by subsequent historians as folklore or misinterpreted observations of normal wildlife, now seem profoundly significant. It suggested a relationship between humans and these beings that had once been acknowledged and respected, a relationship based on mutual recognition of stewardship rather than fear or worship. As autumn progressed and winter approached, my opportunities for exploration diminished. School commitments and the earlier darkness of fall days limited my visits to weekends, and even then, primarily to the more accessible areas near the sandbar. The Watcher's presence became more elusive, though occasional signs, arranged stones on familiar paths, carefully placed objects that could not have arrived by natural means, indicated continued awareness of my movements. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the possibility of renewed exploration, my perspective had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a teenager's casual curiosity about artifacts had evolved into a profound appreciation for a broader, more complex relationship between humans, other intelligent beings, and the land itself. I continued to visit the woods throughout my high school years, though I never again experienced the direct communication that had characterized that remarkable summer. Whether the being had moved to more remote areas or simply maintained a greater distance, I could not determine. But its influence remained in my choice of anthropology as a college major, in my approach to archaeological sites as places deserving protection rather than exploitation, and in my unwavering conviction that human understanding of intelligence and consciousness remains profoundly limited. Now, as an adult working in Texas, I return to that property when possible during visits home. Mr. Hodges still owns the land, though advancing age has limited his own interaction with it. My father still fishes the sandbar occasionally, and my brother has introduced his own children to the river's pleasures. I have shared portions of my experiences with a few trusted individuals. My cousin Jake eventually admitted to his own strange encounters in those woods, and my uncle once acknowledged, after several beers around a campfire, that some things in those trees ain't ever been properly named by science, but the fullest account remains here in these pages. I offer it not as evidence demanding belief or investigation, but as testimony to possibilities that extend beyond conventional understanding to relationships between different forms of intelligence that might be re-established if approached with respect rather than exploitation. The woods along the Oconee River hold their secrets still, protected by both human discretion and non-human vigilance. And somewhere beneath those ancient trees, I believe, the Watcher continues its patient stewardship, observing, communicating in its wordless fashion, and occasionally revealing itself to those who demonstrate the capacity to see without disturbing, to learn without taking, and to respect boundaries both seen and unseen. In that silent understanding lies a wisdom our species would do well to recover, a recognition that we share this world with intelligences both similar to and profoundly different from our own, and that mutual respect may offer better pathways to knowledge than conquest or classification ever could. I was slumped against the fence at the end of our driveway, trying to wake up enough to face another dull day of middle school, when the rocks under my shoes started shifting. A faint rumble passed beneath my feet, like something colossal was stirring underground. Before I could process it, the mailbox beside me clattered so hard I thought it would rip off its post. My brother and sister yelped and we all stumbled backward. It was early, barely light, and the whole world seemed to wobble in a way that made my stomach feel strange. After maybe 10 seconds of this rolling tremor, everything stilled. An eerie hush swallowed the yard. No birds, no wind, like nature was stunned by what just happened. Dad rushed out of the house, his face etched with worry, muttering something about power lines. He knelt to examine the new cracks clawing through the dirt near the porch steps. Mum hovered in the doorway, eyes darting between us kids and the yard. My brother tried to crack a joke. He always does when he's nervous, but his voice shook. Not 5 minutes later, an announcement blared from Dad's old radio in the workshop. School was cancelled. With the bus route probably wrecked or delayed by the quake, nobody was taking chances. I can't say I was disappointed. My sister and I exchanged glances, half relieved, half buzzing with excitement. The earthquake registered 5.2 on the Richter scale, according to the emergency broadcast. Strong enough to damage some buildings downtown and crack foundations, but not devastating. Our house, perched on the outskirts of town where the mountains began to rise, had weathered the shock fairly well. A few picture frames had tumbled from walls, and Mum's prized china teacups rattled precariously on their shelf. But we'd escaped major destruction. The power flickered intermittently throughout the morning. Reception on phones was spotty at best, with towers likely damaged. Dad paced around the house with his battery-powered radio pressed against his ear, listening intently to reports of road closures and emergency response efforts. Mum inventoried our supplies, counting canned goods and bottled water, while occasionally glancing nervously at the ceiling, as if expecting aftershocks to bring it down. I stood at the window, watching dust still hanging in the morning air from where the road had broken up in places. Though I'd never been through a quake before, something about this one felt different. Wrong somehow. The ground had shifted in ways that seemed purposeful rather than random. I couldn't shake the feeling that the earth hadn't just moved. It had rearranged itself. Even though an earthquake is dangerous, part of me kept thinking this might mean a day free from boring math and the chance to poke around our mountainside without any grown-ups telling us no. Jackson, my best friend since I could walk, showed up not long after, practically vibrating with energy. He loved anything out of the ordinary. He didn't even knock, just burst through the front door, hollering about how a couple chimneys on his street had fallen. We huddled in the living room, talking over each other about the quake, about how maybe the old logging roads up by the ridge had caved in or something. Even my younger sister, who usually stuck to reading, seemed intrigued. Dad overheard us buzzing about the ridge and cut in, telling us to leave those weakened slopes alone. The quake, he warned, could have loosened the rocks. Mum looked equally uneasy, insisting we stay close to the house. Of course, that only fueled our determination to see the damage for ourselves. Once Dad turned his attention to the radio and Mom started fussing with the dishes, my brother and I locked eyes with Jackson. It was time. We slipped outside, telling Mom we'd just check around the yard, which was technically true. But as soon as we were a safe distance down the driveway, we veered off toward the trail that led up behind the orchard. The early morning chill clung to my jacket, and the ground felt spongy where the quake had rearranged the soil. Broken branches littered the path. Every few steps, Jackson or my brother would point out fresh cracks in the earth, some running shallow, others diving deeper, like the land had been sliced open. We reached the edge of the ridge, panting from the climb. Loose stones clattered beneath our feet, rolling down the slope. One big boulder had torn loose completely, leaving a raw gash in the hill. Even from a few yards away, it looked ominous. A dark slice in the earth, partially hidden by sagging roots and clumps of damp leaves. My sister tugged at my sleeve, saying she wasn't sure we should get too close. I remember an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach. Something about the way the ground had ripped open felt wrong. Still, I couldn't help stepping closer, trying to see if the quake had revealed anything hidden beneath the dirt. Jackson, always braver than smart, hopped forward and yanked at a clump of torn roots. He blinked, then waved us over with wide eyes. Between the muddy vines and toppled rocks lay a narrow crevice, big enough to squeeze into if you tried. A weird draft seeped out, carrying a smell I couldn't place, somewhere between old leaves and something metallic. My brother wanted to see if it went anywhere, but my sister backed away, crossing her arms tight. Just then, we heard Dad calling our names from below. He must have guessed we'd ignored his warnings. We scattered from the ridge, slipping and sliding over damp rocks until we were back on more solid ground. I glanced over my shoulder at that hidden gap in the hillside, feeling uneasy but also strangely captivated. It felt like a secret, and if we didn't explore it, the opportunity would vanish. When we reached home, Dad scolded us, told us to stay put, and threatened chores if we kept wandering. But I couldn't stop thinking about that crevice, even as I tried to help Mom with some cleanup and pretend I was listening to Dad talk about the biggest quake he'd ever felt. My mind drifted back to that opening. Later, I asked Jackson if he'd ever known about any cave systems up there. He shrugged, grinning in that excited way he gets whenever there's a mystery. My brother, overhearing us, started pulling out Dad's old map of the area, though it didn't show anything unusual in that spot. Mum, not fooled for a second by our apparent cooperation, reminded us we'd get grounded if we went up there again. But once something piques your curiosity at that age, it's all you can think about. The quake had ripped open a piece of our world we'd never seen before. We had to check it out. That night, while the rest of the family tried to settle down, I lay in bed, wide awake, picturing that hidden crevice under the ridge. Questions spun in my mind. How deep did it go? Was there something inside? That subtle metallic odor still lingered in my nose whenever I recalled the draft escaping from the hole. Whatever it was, I knew I wasn't going to sleep peacefully until we investigated further. And so, even though my sister warned me over and over that it was a bad idea and Dad had threatened chores for a month, I caught myself making a plan. Jackson and my brother were on board. The quake had given us an unexpected day off, and we intended to use it, no matter the risk. Before dawn the next morning, I was already awake, stuffing supplies into my backpack. A flashlight with fresh batteries, a water bottle, some granola bars, a small first aid kit I'd pilfered from the bathroom cabinet, a pocket knife that had been a birthday gift from my uncle. I even thought to bring a ball of string, remembering a story I'd once read about explorers using it to find their way back through a labyrinth. Jackson appeared at my window just after 6, his face flushed with excitement. My brother joined us in the hallway, tiptoeing past our parents' bedroom. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his own flashlight. I noticed he'd brought Dad's old mining helmet with the lamp attached, something our grandfather had used decades ago when he worked in the coal mines down south. It seemed excessive then, but later I'd be grateful for his foresight. We left a note saying we'd gone to check on friends in the neighborhood, knowing it would buy us a few hours at least. The morning air was crisp, and a light fog hung over the valley below, giving everything a dreamlike quality. As we climbed the ridge again, an uneasy silence fell between us. The initial thrill of adventure was gradually being replaced by something heavier, an instinctive wariness that none of us were willing to acknowledge. We crept back into that dark mouth of the earth, driven by a reckless need to understand what had been waiting for us behind the ridge. With only a single lantern and our flashlights to guide our uncertain steps, my brother Jackson and I eased ourselves into the narrow corridor of twisted roots and wet stone. Every step felt like crossing a forbidden threshold. The feeble light casting restless dancing shadows on walls that seemed to whisper secrets of decay. The further we went, the thicker the air grew, suffused with the rank odor of rotting vegetation and a sharp metallic tang that burned at the back of my throat. I had to force myself to breathe through my mouth, each inhalation bringing discomfort as the stagnant air filled my lungs. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, and I could see our breath forming small clouds in the beam of light. The passage narrowed in places, forcing us to turn sideways and squeeze through. In other spots, it widened unexpectedly into small chambers where water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Jackson traced the strange formations on the walls with his fingers, pointing out how some looked almost like claw marks, while others resembled odd, geometric patterns that seemed too precise to be natural. "I don't think anyone's been down here before," he whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. "At least not for a really long time." My brother nodded, shining his light on what appeared to be ancient tree roots that had pushed through the rock over centuries. "This place has been forming for ages," he said. "The earthquake just gave us a way in." Soon enough, our path widened into a cramped chamber where the beam of our lantern revealed a grotesque scattering of bones. I could tell some belonged to small animals, a stray dog, perhaps a raccoon or even a deer, left in a macabre display of nature's indifference. The sight was as repulsive as it was mesmerizing. Flies buzzed relentlessly around some of the fresher remains, adding a constant, maddening drone to the silence. As we inched along, a slow drip began echoing through the confined space, each drop measured and deliberate, like the ticking of a grim clock counting down our inevitable discovery. I knelt by the wall, tracing faint scratch-like marks that ran along the stone, and found clumps of coarse dark hair caught in the crevices. These marks suggested that something large and agitated had once or still roamed these depths. "Should we go back?" my brother asked, his voice barely audible. His face, illuminated by the ghostly glow of the helmet lamp, looked pale and drawn. Jackson shook his head, already moving deeper into the tunnel. "We've come this far," he insisted. "Don't you want to know what's down here?" I hesitated, torn between mounting dread and insatiable curiosity. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings, that we were trespassing somewhere we shouldn't be, that natural caves could harbor dangerous gases or structural instabilities. But something stronger pulled me forward, a compulsion to uncover what lay hidden in the darkness ahead. At the far end of the chamber, the ground sloped sharply downward. The floor became a slick, treacherous path that led us to what appeared to be a natural ledge overlooking a yawning chasm. A sudden burst of hot, humid air surged upward from the pit, as if exhaling from some hidden lung deep in the darkness. Jackson fumbled with a ragged scrap of cloth he'd soaked in lighter fluid, until we managed to ignite it into a makeshift torch. Its erratic flame trembled over the edge, casting a shaky light that barely held back the consuming blackness below. The chasm seemed to stretch downward endlessly, its depth impossible to gauge with our limited light sources. In that wavering glow, I caught sight of movement, a massive fluid shape sliding just beyond our feeble light. It moved too quickly to be clearly seen, yet its presence was unmistakable. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks. When I looked again, the darkness seemed to shift and ripple, as if something solid was moving through it. "Did you see that?" I whispered, gripping my brother's arm. He nodded, speechless, his eyes wide with terror. Jackson had gone completely still, the torch trembling in his hand. Before we could exchange another word, a low, guttural sound rumbled up from the depths. It wasn't quite a growl, but rather a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The sound grew louder, transforming into something primal and threatening. Then came a roar, an explosion of sound that shattered any semblance of calm. The impact of that roar was more than mere noise. It pounded through my skull, making my limbs tremble uncontrollably. I sank to the uneven ground, ears straining against the overwhelming assault. Jackson fell beside me, his body folding in on itself as we both struggled to catch fleeting, scattered breaths. In the midst of the chaos, I managed a fragmented glimpse. Two glowing red points, unblinking and fierce, fixed on us from somewhere in that abyss. For what felt like an eternity, time slowed as the sound and sight merged into a single horrifying moment. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet I remained frozen, ensnared by the sheer force of that sound. An oppressive, all-consuming vibration that robbed me of thought. The presence below was undeniable, its power magnified by the darkness that cradled it. I knew then that whatever lurked below was far beyond anything our wild imaginations could have conjured. Struggling against the paralysis that held me, I forced my aching body to shift, determined to drag myself away from that cursed ledge. But the roar continued, echoing off the walls of the cavern like a promise that this was only the beginning. With every pulse of that terrible sound, the chasm seemed to pull us in deeper, into a nightmare that we had only just begun to understand. The ground beneath us vibrated with increasing intensity. Small pebbles danced across the stone floor, and larger rocks began to break loose from the ceiling. The earthquake had weakened the structural integrity of the cave, and now something, whether the creature's roar or some natural seismic aftershock, was causing it to collapse. "We need to get out, now!" My brother screamed over the deafening noise, pulling at my jacket with desperate force. I don't remember the exact moment when we realized we had to run, only that the creature's roar shattered every thought of courage we'd mustered. My brother's grip on my arm tightened as we scrambled up the treacherous slope, the slick, uneven ground turning every step into a desperate fight for survival. I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my ears, a relentless ringing that felt like it was hammering my skull. Every fiber of my being screamed to move, and yet fear paralyzed me for split seconds before adrenaline forced my limbs into action. The cavern behind us was filled with unearthly sounds, that terrible roar still reverberating off the stone walls, haunted my every step. Rocks tumbled down around us as the ceiling began to give way. A large boulder crashed down inches from Jackson's head, showering us with sharp fragments that cut into exposed skin. The tunnel seemed different, longer, more convoluted than it had during our descent. Had we taken a wrong turn? I fought against rising panic as we raced through narrowing passages, our lights bouncing wildly off glistening walls that seemed to close in with each passing second. "This way!" my brother shouted, yanking me toward a crevice I didn't recognize. "I can feel air moving." We squeezed through the tight opening, scraping skin and tearing clothes. Behind us, an ominous rumble signaled that sections of the cave were collapsing. The air grew thick with dust, making it nearly impossible to breathe without coughing. I remember the acrid smell of burnt wood from our abandoned torch mingling with wet stone as we burst out into the weak morning light. Outside, the chill of the air hit me like a slap, a harsh reminder that the nightmare was far from over. I stumbled over jagged rocks and broken roots, my heart hammering so fiercely I thought it might burst through my ribcage. We didn't stop running until the ridge was a distant, dark memory behind us. When we finally collapsed onto a patch of rough grass, my brother was pale and shaking, his eyes wide with disbelief. Jackson was quiet, his face blank and numb, as though the creature's malevolence had sucked every ounce of color from his soul. I tried to speak, to demand that we recount what we'd seen, but my throat was raw, and the words died before they could form. We sat in silence, each trapped in our private horror, until our breathing steadied and the immediate terror began to recede. "What was that?" Jackson finally whispered, his voice cracking. "What did we see down there?" My brother shook his head, refusing to meet our eyes. "I don't know. I don't want to know." I looked back toward the ridge, half expecting to see something emerging from the earth, pursuing us into the daylight. But there was only the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of emergency vehicles in the town below. "We can't tell anyone," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. "They'll think we're crazy." The others nodded in silent agreement. Some secrets were too heavy, too impossible for others to comprehend. Later that day, back at home, our parents hardly recognized us. Dad's angry scoldings were drowned out by the silence in our eyes, the unspoken terror of something beyond explanation. I couldn't shake the sensation that every creak in the house, every whisper of the wind, was a reminder of that monstrous sound from deep within the earth. My ears still rang, a high-pitched whine that persisted long after the creature's voice faded. The doctor later said it was likely from shock and the intense sound pressure, but his clinical words did nothing to ease the dread that clung to my skin. For days, I lay in bed with the darkness behind my eyelids, filled with that scene, the crimson unblinking eyes in the depths of that pit, the low, guttural growl that seemed to speak directly to my worst fears. Sleep was elusive. When I finally dozed off, it wasn't rest at all, but a torturous replay of that horror, complete with the creature's roar echoing in every nightmare. I woke up curled in a ball, drenched in sweat, convinced that at any moment those red eyes would appear again. The local news reported the earthquake had caused unexpected geological shifts, opening sinkholes and revealing previously unknown cave systems throughout the region. Scientists arrived to study the phenomenon, and I watched with growing anxiety as they set up equipment near the ridge. Would they find the crevice? Would they discover what lurked below? A week later, 3 researchers went missing while exploring newly formed openings in the mountainside. Search parties combed the area for days, but found nothing except abandoned equipment and inexplicable damage to their vehicles. The official report blamed a rockslide for their disappearance, but I knew better. I recognized the haunted look in the eyes of the search party members when they returned empty-handed. In the weeks that followed, our little group of adventurers was irreversibly changed. Jackson drifted away into silence, barely speaking to anyone and keeping to himself, as if the memory of that underground terror was a secret too painful to share. My brother, once so full of wild energy, now avoided even the hint of a cave or a dark, forgotten corner of the woods. And me, I became haunted by every creak in the floorboards and every shadow that moved in the periphery of my vision. I developed an aversion to enclosed spaces. Elevators, closets, even my own bedroom at night with the door closed could trigger overwhelming panic. My parents worried, arranging therapy sessions with a psychologist who nodded sympathetically while I fed her sanitized versions of what had happened. Post-traumatic stress from the earthquake, she concluded, prescribing relaxation techniques that did nothing to banish the red eyes from my dreams. The ridge became off-limits, cordoned off by authorities after a series of unexplained tremors continued to reshape the landscape. They installed seismic monitoring equipment and posted warning signs about unstable ground. I watched from my bedroom window as trucks and scientific equipment came and went, knowing they would never understand what they were truly dealing with. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I felt subtle vibrations through the floor, as if something massive was moving deep beneath the Earth's surface. On those nights, I would press my ear to the ground, holding my breath, listening for that terrible roar to rise again from the depths. Years later, when another minor tremor rattled our sleepy town, I couldn't ignore the pull to return. I made my way back to the ridge, driven by a mixture of dread and a desperate need for closure. The cave's entrance was partly collapsed now, a jagged scar on the hillside, yet I could still feel that old metallic odor drifting out like a whisper from a forgotten nightmare. Standing there, I felt the weight of memory pressing down on me. 7 years had passed since that day. I was 19 now, about to leave for college, desperate to put distance between myself and this place. Yet I knew I couldn't truly leave until I faced what happened. The scientific equipment had long since been removed, the tremors officially classified as normal seismic activity for the region. But locals avoided the area. Hikers reported strange sounds, unexplained equipment failures, and an overwhelming sense of dread that forced them to turn back. Wild animals seemed to have deserted the vicinity, creating an unnatural silence that hung heavy in the air. I hadn't spoken to Jackson in years. His family had moved away 6 months after the incident, seeking a fresh start, according to his mother. My brother had gone to technical school in another state, rarely returning home, except for holidays. We never discussed what happened, maintaining our unspoken pact of silence. But I could see in his eyes, when we did meet, that the memory remained as vivid for him as it was for me. As I stood before the partially sealed entrance, part of me wanted to turn away, to preserve the fragile normalcy I'd constructed. But I needed answers. I needed to know if what we'd encountered was real or merely the product of 3 terrified children's imaginations, amplified by darkness and fear. I didn't enter. I wasn't that foolish. Instead, I placed a small digital recorder at the entrance, secured to a long cord that would allow me to retrieve it without venturing inside. Then I waited, sitting on a boulder a safe distance away, watching the shadows lengthen as afternoon turned to evening. As darkness fell, I pulled the recorder back and, with trembling fingers, pressed play. At first, there was nothing but the ambient sounds of wind and distant traffic. Then beneath those normal sounds, something else emerged, a low, rhythmic pulsing that made my skin crawl with recognition. It wasn't the full-throated roar we'd heard years ago, but rather a steady, patient breathing. The sound of something waiting. I destroyed the recorder that night, smashing it to pieces with a rock before burying the fragments. Some evidence should never be preserved. Some discoveries should remain hidden. Standing there, I felt the chill of the memory run down my spine. Every time I closed my eyes, I still heard that thunderous roar and saw those blazing eyes locked in a silent promise that whatever lurked in that dark pit was waiting, biding its time. I don't know if I'll ever be free of that terror. The scars, both seen and unseen, remain etched into my memory. I live each day with the quiet knowledge that something unnatural still lurks beneath the surface, waiting for the next tremor, the next lapse in our guard. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is still, I swear I can hear it echoing from that cursed place, reminding me that some secrets should never be unearthed. This happened to my friend Jordan and me during the early months of 2020, when the world was just starting to change in ways none of us anticipated. We both attended a mid-sized university on California's Central Coast, sharing an off-campus apartment to save on rent. Like most college students, our weekends were typically filled with study sessions and the occasional social gathering. But this particular weekend in early March would prove to be unlike any other. Jordan had been browsing adoption websites for weeks, searching for a dog to foster. He'd always wanted a pet, and with the rumors of potential lockdowns circulating, he figured it was the perfect time to bring one home. When he found a match, a 2-year-old shepherd mix at a shelter about 90 miles north, he immediately asked if I wanted to join him for the drive. Road trip. He texted me on Thursday night. Going to pick up a dog on Saturday. Shelter's up in Bayshore. I agreed without hesitation. The semester had been grueling, and a day away from campus seemed like exactly what I needed. Plus, Jordan didn't like making long drives alone, and I could tell he was nervous about the whole fostering process. Saturday morning arrived with unusual clarity for March. Crisp air, cloudless sky, the kind of perfect California day that makes you forget about impending global crises. Jordan pulled up in his aging Honda Civic at precisely 8:30 a.m. The car had seen better days, with its faded blue paint and the persistent rattle that emerged at highway speeds. But it was reliable enough for our purposes. "Ready for this?" Jordan asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. His excitement was palpable, eyes bright behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, tossing my backpack onto the rear seat. "How long's the drive again?" "About 2 hours if traffic's decent," he said, pulling away from the curb. "We should be there by 11. The shelter opens at 10, but they're holding him for me until noon." The drive north was uneventful. We passed through familiar towns that gradually gave way to stretches of farmland, the landscape occasionally interrupted by strip malls and gas stations. Jordan played his usual playlist, indie rock mixed with occasional 90s hits, while we discussed everything from upcoming exams to predictions about how long this coronavirus thing might last. "My mom thinks we'll be back to normal by summer," I said, watching the agricultural fields speed by outside my window. Jordan shook his head. "No way. My cousin works at a hospital in Seattle. Says it's just the beginning." Looking back now, the normalcy of that conversation haunts me. How unaware we were of what would unfold over the coming months, both in the world at large and in our own lives over the next 24 hours. We arrived in Bayshore just after 11 a.m. It was a modest coastal town, the kind that tourist brochures describe as charming, but locals might call sleepy. The shelter was located on the outskirts, a single-story building with chain-link kennels visible around the back. "This is it," Jordan said, his voice tight with anticipation as he parked. "Let's go meet my new roommate." Neither of us could have predicted how this simple errand would spiral into the most terrifying experience of our lives. The shelter was surprisingly busy for a Saturday morning. Several families milled about the reception area, forms in hand, while volunteers led potential adopters to and from the kennels. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, an unmistakable shelter aroma that tickled my nose. Jordan approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with cropped gray hair greeted us with a tired smile. Her name tag read, "Volunteer Barbara." "Hi, I'm Jordan Wilson. I called earlier this week about fostering the shepherd mix. I have an appointment at noon, but we're a bit early." Barbara nodded, tapping at her computer keyboard. "Right, you're here for Rusty. Let me see if he's ready." She made a quick call on an ancient-looking desk phone, then nodded. "Melissa will bring him out in just a moment. In the meantime, I need you to complete these forms." Jordan took the clipboard she offered, and we found seats in a corner of the waiting area. As he filled out the paperwork, I noticed a bulletin board covered with success stories, photographs of adopted animals with their new families. The images portrayed pure joy, but something about the faded pictures and yellowing paper made me uneasy. "Nervous?" I asked, noticing Jordan's leg bouncing up and down as he wrote. "A little," he admitted. "I've never had a dog before. What if I mess it up?" "You'll be fine," I assured him. "Plus, it's just fostering, right? If it doesn't work out, you're not stuck." Before Jordan could respond, a door opened and a volunteer emerged, leading a medium-sized dog with golden-brown fur and alert ears. The dog, Rusty, walked cautiously, his eyes darting around the room, taking in all the unfamiliar scents and sounds. "Jordan?" the volunteer called. "This is Rusty." Jordan's face lit up as he crossed the room. He crouched down, extending his hand palm up for Rusty to sniff. The dog approached tentatively, nose working overtime, before giving Jordan's fingers a gentle lick. "He's perfect," Jordan whispered, stroking the dog's head. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork, instructions, and a brief training session on handling techniques. Rusty seemed to grow more comfortable with each passing minute, especially when Jordan produced a small bag of treats from his pocket. He'd come prepared. "He hasn't had the easiest life," Melissa explained as she handed over Rusty's leash. "Found wandering near the highway 3 months ago. No chip, no collar. He's still a bit skittish around men, especially tall ones, but he's come a long way." By the time we left the shelter, it was nearly 1 p.m. Rusty settled into the back seat of the Honda, circling a few times before curling up on an old blanket Jordan had brought along. Each time we glanced back, the dog was watching us with those intelligent amber eyes, as if trying to figure out what strange new turn his life had taken. "Hungry?" Jordan asked as we merged onto the highway. I'm starving. Definitely, I agreed. Want to grab something before we head back? There's supposed to be a decent burger place in the next town over, about 15 minutes from here. Neither of us realized then that this simple decision to delay our return trip would lead us directly into danger. If we had simply driven straight home, everything that followed might have been avoided. But hindsight offers no protection against what waits in the shadows, watching for vulnerability. We found the burger place easily enough, a local joint called Coast Burgers, located in a small strip mall. The COVID situation was just beginning to affect businesses. Inside, half the tables were marked as closed for social distancing, a term that was still relatively new to our vocabulary. Maybe we should just take it to go, Jordan suggested, eyeing the limited seating. Find somewhere outside to eat. We ordered our food at the counter, 2 cheeseburger combos and an extra plain patty for Rusty, and waited outside with the dog, who was clearly overwhelmed by all the new smells and sights. The March sun felt good against my skin, warm but not hot, the kind of perfect spring day that typically filled me with optimism. Where should we eat? I asked once our order was ready.
Back in the car?
Jordan shook his head. Let's find a park or something. Give Rusty a chance to stretch his legs before the drive back. I pulled out my phone and searched for nearby parks. There's one called Pine Ridge Park about 3 minutes from here. Has decent reviews. We loaded back into the car, the smell of fresh burgers filling the small space and making Rusty whine with anticipation. The park was easy to find, a modest green space with scattered picnic tables, a small playground, and pathways winding through stands of tall pines that gave the park its name. The parking lot was nearly empty when we arrived, with only one other vehicle present, a weathered silver sedan parked near the restroom facilities. I remember thinking how strange it was to see a public park so deserted on such a beautiful Saturday. But of course, people were already beginning to avoid public spaces as news of the virus spread. Jordan parked along the curb, directly in front of the silver sedan. We gathered our food and Rusty's leash and made our way to a picnic table about 20 feet from where we'd parked. The dog seemed delighted to be outside, sniffing enthusiastically at every bush and tree trunk we passed. "Here looks good," Jordan said, gesturing to a sun-dappled table. He secured Rusty's leash to a nearby permanent grill fixture, giving the dog enough slack to lie down comfortably beside us while still ensuring he couldn't wander off. We had barely unwrapped our burgers when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A man was approaching us from the direction of the restrooms, tall and lanky, with a weathered face and clothes that seemed slightly too large for his frame. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 40 and 60, and there was something in his gait that immediately put me on edge, a kind of deliberate casualness that felt rehearsed. Jordan noticed him too, and instinctively shifted closer to Rusty, who had begun to growl softly. "Afternoon," the man said as he drew near, his voice surprisingly gentle given his rough appearance. "That's a fine-looking dog you've got there." "Thanks," Jordan replied, his tone cautious but polite. The man stopped about 6 feet from our table, close enough for conversation, but maintaining what might have seemed like respectful distance. "What's his name?" Rusty, the man repeated as if testing the name. "How old is he?" "About 2, we think. Just adopted him today." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. "You mean, does he bite?" The question hung in the air, weighted with something I couldn't quite place. Jordan continued answering the man's increasingly specific questions about Rusty, his temperament, his training, whether he was protective, while trying to calm the dog, who had grown visibly agitated. I felt a growing unease crawling up my spine. While Jordan focused on controlling Rusty, I became acutely aware that the man wasn't looking at the dog when he asked these questions. He was looking at us, studying our reactions, our posture, our level of alertness. Eventually, the questions stopped, but the man didn't leave. He simply stood there, staring, his expression blank. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, he turned and walked away toward a covered pavilion area adjacent to the restrooms. "That was weird," Jordan muttered, returning his attention to his half-eaten burger. "Yeah," I agreed. But something compelled me to keep watching the man. As he reached the pavilion, I noticed he wasn't alone. Another man, shorter but more solidly built, was sitting at a table beneath the canopy. The tall man joined him, and they began speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in our direction. "Jordan," I said quietly, "I think we're being watched." "What do you mean?" He turned to look, and sure enough, both men were now openly staring at us, making no attempt to hide their interest. "Maybe we should go," I suggested, my appetite suddenly gone. Jordan nodded, but before we could gather our things, I noticed the stocky man had disappeared from view. Scanning the area, I caught movement near a vending machine about halfway between the pavilion and our table. The tall man was crouching behind it, peering around the edge, watching us with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. "We need to leave, now." The urgency in my voice must have conveyed the danger I sensed, because Jordan didn't hesitate. He quickly untied Rusty while I gathered our food and belongings. All pretense of a leisurely meal abandoned, we moved swiftly toward Jordan's car, Rusty picking up on our anxiety and keeping close without pulling on his leash. As we reached the vehicle, the stocky man suddenly appeared, approaching from behind the silver sedan. "Excuse me," he called, his voice surprisingly soft for his build. "Beautiful dog. Mind if I ask you a few questions about him?" "Sorry, we're in a hurry," Jordan replied, fumbling with his keys. The man drew closer. "Is he protective? Does he bite strangers?" The question, identical to what the tall man had asked earlier, confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't random curiosity. They were assessing a potential threat, evaluating how difficult we might be to subdue. Jordan managed to unlock the car, and we quickly piled in. Me in the passenger seat, Rusty in the back. As Jordan started the engine, I glanced in the side mirror and saw the stocky man walk unhurriedly to the silver sedan. The tall man emerged from behind the vending machine and joined him. "Drive," I urged. "Just drive." Jordan pulled out of the parking space with more haste than caution, the tires briefly skidding on loose gravel. In the rearview mirror, I could see the silver sedan's headlights flick on. "I think they're following us," I said, twisting in my seat to look back as we exited the park. "Are you sure?" Jordan asked, but his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel betrayed his own certainty. "Take a random turn," I suggested. "Let's see what happens." We were in an unfamiliar town with no clear escape route. Jordan turned right at the first intersection, deviating from the main road that would have taken us back to the highway. The sedan followed, maintaining a consistent distance behind us. "Coincidence," Jordan offered weakly. I shook my head. "Try another turn." Jordan complied, making a left at the next opportunity, then an immediate right into a residential neighborhood of modest single-story homes. The sedan remained behind us, closing the gap slightly. "What do they want?" Jordan's voice cracked with fear. "Should we call the police?" I pulled out my phone but hesitated. "And say what?" "That we're being followed. We don't have proof they're doing anything illegal." "They were asking about the dog," Jordan said, making another turn to test our pursuers' intentions. "Why would they care so much about whether he bites or not?" The realization hit us simultaneously. They wanted to know if the dog would protect us, if he posed a threat to whatever they had planned. "I think they're targeting us because we're from out of town," I said, the pieces falling into place. "We're in an unfamiliar area. No one knows we're here. And we have a new dog that probably won't protect us effectively." The silver sedan continued its pursuit, now close enough that I could make out two silhouettes in the front seats. Jordan's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and even Rusty seemed to sense our fear, whining softly from the back seat. "There's a gas station up ahead," Jordan said, pointing to a brightly lit convenience store at the next intersection. "Lots of people, security cameras." Good idea, but as we approached the gas station, the sedan suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside us. The passenger window rolled down, and the tall man leaned out slightly, making direct eye contact with me. He didn't speak or gesture, just stared with cold intensity before the sedan surged ahead, cutting sharply in front of us. Jordan slammed on the brakes, the Honda's tires squealing in protest. "What the hell?" The sedan had effectively blocked our path to the gas station, forcing Jordan to veer right down a side street to avoid collision. Our pursuers didn't follow immediately, but as we turned onto yet another unfamiliar road, the sedan reappeared in our rearview mirror. "They're herding us," I realized aloud, "driving us away from public areas." Jordan's face had drained of color. "What do we do?" "Find a main road. Get back to the highway where there are other cars." We navigated the increasingly narrow residential streets, making random turns in hopes of losing our pursuers or finding our way back to a busier thoroughfare. The silver sedan stayed with us, sometimes dropping back only to reappear moments later, toying with us like predators with cornered prey. Rusty had become agitated in the back seat, moving from window to window, growling intermittently. His behavior only heightened our sense of danger. If the dog could sense something wrong, our fears weren't paranoia. After several minutes of this terrifying cat-and-mouse game, Jordan spotted a sign for the highway. "There, 3 blocks ahead." But as we approached the intersection that would lead us to safety, the sedan accelerated again, this time pulling directly behind us so close that their headlights filled our car with harsh light. "They're going to ram us," I gasped, bracing myself against the dashboard. Jordan reacted instinctively, yanking the wheel hard to the right and accelerating through a gap between parked cars, cutting through a corner gas station's lot. The maneuver gave us precious seconds of advantage, enough to reach the highway entrance ramp before our pursuers could realign. As we merged onto the highway, Jordan pushed his aging Honda to speeds it rarely achieved, the engine protesting with a high-pitched whine. The speedometer crept past 80, then 90. "Do you see them?" Jordan asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I scanned the rearview mirror, searching for the silver sedan among the thankfully present Saturday afternoon traffic. "I don't think so," I said after a full minute of vigilance. "I think we lost them." Jordan maintained his speed for several more miles before gradually slowing to a less conspicuous pace. Neither of us spoke, processing what had just happened, the silence broken only by Rusty's occasional whimpers from the back seat. Finally, Jordan voiced what we were both thinking. What would have happened if they caught us? I had no answer, only the bone-deep certainty that we had narrowly avoided something unspeakable. After 20 minutes of highway driving, with no sign of the silver sedan, our breathing began to normalize. The adrenaline that had sustained us during the chase gradually ebbed, leaving us shaky and exhausted. "We should stop somewhere," Jordan suggested. "Call the police, report what happened." "Where, though?" I asked. "We're still too close to that town." Jordan considered this. "There's a rest area coming up in a few miles. Lots of people, security cameras. We can pull over there." The rest area appeared as promised, a modest facility with restrooms, vending machines, and a handful of picnic tables. About a dozen vehicles were parked in the lot, their occupants stretching legs or walking dogs after long drives. The normalcy of the scene was reassuring after our ordeal. Jordan parked near the center of the lot, positioning the car so we had clear sightlines in all directions. "I need to let Rusty out," he said. "He's been cooped up for hours." I nodded, though the thought of leaving the relative safety of the car made my stomach clench. "I'll come with you." We took turns using the restroom, while the other stayed with Rusty, who seemed grateful for the opportunity to relieve himself and sniff the perimeter of the small grassy area designated for pets. Despite the ordinary surroundings, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, my eyes constantly scanning for any sign of the silver sedan or its occupants. "Should we call the police now?" Jordan asked as we returned to the car. I weighed our options. What would we tell them? That two men asked about our dog and then followed us? We don't have license plates, clear descriptions, or any real evidence that they meant us harm. We know what happened, Jordan insisted. Yes, but aside, frustration mingling with lingering fear. Let's at least put some more distance between us and them. Maybe stop in a bigger town where we can talk to police in person. Jordan reluctantly agreed, and we got back on the highway, heading south toward home. The miles passed uneventfully, each one increasing our sense of security. We even began to discuss what had happened with a hint of detachment, as if analyzing a thriller movie rather than our own recent experience. Why do you think they targeted us? Jordan wondered aloud. Wrong place, wrong time, I suggested. Two college students, unfamiliar territory, new dog that doesn't know us well enough to protect us. We must have looked like easy marks. For what, though? Robbery? I hesitated, unwilling to voice the darker possibilities that had occurred to me. Maybe. Or they could have been trying to steal Rusty. Purebred dogs can sell for thousands. Neither of us believed these explanations, but they were easier to contemplate than the alternatives. As the afternoon stretched on, hunger began to reassert itself. We had abandoned our lunch at the first park, after all. When we spotted signs for a small coastal town with a prominent outlet mall, the prospect of food and crowds proved too tempting to resist. We could stop there, I suggested. Get something to eat, maybe talk to security about what happened. Jordan agreed, and we exited the highway. The outlet mall was bustling with weekend shoppers, providing an anonymity that felt protective after the targeted attention we'd experienced earlier. We found a parking space in a crowded lot, surrounded by families loading shopping bags into minivans and couples strolling between stores. I'll stay with Rusty while you grab us some food, Jordan offered. There's a sandwich place by the entrance. I hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of separation. Are you sure? We'll be fine, he assured me. There are people everywhere. Besides, we lost those guys hours ago. Reluctantly, I agreed and made my way to the sandwich shop, constantly glancing back at Jordan's blue Honda, where he waited with Rusty. The line moved slowly, each minute apart, stretching my nerves tighter. When I finally returned with our food, the relief was palpable. Everything okay? I asked, sliding back into the passenger seat. All good, Jordan confirmed, accepting his sandwich gratefully. Rusty's been a perfect gentleman, even made friends with a poodle that walked by. We ate in companionable silence, the normal activity of the mall parking lot gradually soothing our frayed nerves. For the first time since the park, I began to feel that perhaps the danger had passed, that we were safe. Ready to head home? Jordan asked as we finished our meal. I nodded, crumpling my sandwich wrapper. Definitely. I think we've had enough adventure for one day. Jordan started the car and began navigating through the parking lot toward the exit. We were stopped at an internal intersection, waiting for a family to cross, when I happened to glance at the rearview mirror. My blood froze. 3 rows back, partially obscured by a large SUV, but unmistakable in its weathered silver paint, was the sedan. It was stopped, engine running, headlights off despite the approaching dusk. Jordan, I whispered, unable to find my full voice. They're here. Jordan's head snapped around, following my gaze to the rearview mirror. Are you sure it's them? Before I could answer, the silver sedan began to move, pulling out from its parking space with deliberate slowness. It's them, I confirmed, any doubt evaporating as I caught a glimpse of the tall man behind the wheel. How did they find us? Jordan turned back to face forward, his expression hardening with determination. It doesn't matter. We're not playing their game anymore. He accelerated through the parking lot, ignoring the posted speed limit signs, weaving between slower vehicles with uncharacteristic aggression. In the back seat, Rusty whined, sensing our renewed fear. Where are we going? I asked, clinging to the door handle as Jordan took a corner too sharply. Security office. I saw it near the food court entrance. The silver sedan had emerged fully into the main lane now, accelerating to match our pace. Unlike the earlier chase through residential streets, here we were constrained by the crowded parking lot, pedestrians crossing unpredictably, shopping carts abandoned in inconvenient locations. Jordan honked as a group of teenagers meandered across our path, startling them into hurrying. The mall's main entrance came into view, bright lights illuminating the gathering dusk. There, I pointed to a sign indicating mall security. On the right, Jordan angled toward it, but our pursuers had anticipated this move. The silver sedan surged forward, cutting diagonally across the lane to block our access to the security office. Jordan hit the brakes hard, narrowly avoiding collision. "Damn it!" he hissed, frantically searching for another escape route. With the security office now inaccessible, Jordan made a split-second decision, veering left toward the mall's service entrance. The sedan followed, closing the distance between us. "Call 911, Jordan instructed, his voice strained but controlled. "Now." I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. The car lurched as Jordan navigated around a delivery truck, momentarily losing our pursuers. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice sounded impossibly calm, in contrast to our situation. "We're being followed," I blurted out. "Two men in a silver sedan. They've been stalking us across multiple locations today. We're at Pacific Coast Outlets in..." I realized with horror that I didn't know the name of the town we were in. "Where exactly are you located?" the operator prompted. "Jordan, what town is this?" I asked desperately. "Harbor Point," he supplied, eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. I relayed this to the operator, who assured me police were being dispatched. "Stay on the line," she instructed. "Can you get to a public place with other people around?" "We're trying," I explained, "but they're blocking us." "They're..." My words cut off as Jordan executed another sharp turn, this time exiting the mall property entirely onto a service road that ran behind the shopping center. The area was poorly lit, lined with dumpsters and loading docks rather than storefronts. "Jordan, where are we going?" I hissed, covering the phone's microphone. "Back to the highway," he replied grimly. "We can't keep driving around the mall. They'll trap us eventually." The service road connected to a two-lane street that, according to the signs, would lead back to the highway in 3 miles. Jordan accelerated, pushing his Honda to its limits once again. "Are they still following?" he asked, unable to see clearly in the growing darkness. I twisted in my seat, peering through the rear window. For a moment I saw nothing, and relief began to bloom until headlights flared to life about 200 yards behind us, gaining rapidly. "Yes," I confirmed, returning to the 911 operator to update our location. "Officers are en route," she assured me. "Stay on main roads if possible." The highway entrance appeared ahead, a beacon of potential safety. Jordan took the ramp at dangerous speed, merging into thankfully moderate traffic. The silver sedan followed, now close enough that their headlights illuminated our entire car interior. "They're right behind us," I reported, both to Jordan and the 911 operator. "Can you see the license plate?" the operator asked. I strained to make out the numbers through the glare of the headlights. "California plate starts with 7WX. I can't see the rest." "That's helpful," the operator assured me. "What direction are you heading on the highway?" "South," Jordan supplied when I relayed the question. "Towards Santa Cruz." For several tense minutes, we maintained our position in the middle lane, surrounded by other vehicles whose drivers remained oblivious to our plight. The silver sedan stayed directly behind us, maintaining an uncomfortably close distance but making no overtly aggressive moves. "Police are positioning themselves at upcoming exits," the operator informed me. "Can you safely continue for another 10 miles? Before I could answer, the sedan suddenly swerved into the left lane and accelerated, pulling alongside us. Through the passenger window, I could see both men clearly for the first time since the park, the tall one driving, the stocky one in the passenger seat, both staring at us with expressionless faces. "They're right next to us," I told the operator, my voice rising in panic. The stocky man rolled down his window and extended his arm. pointing directly at us before making a pulling motion toward the shoulder. "They want us to pull over," I interpreted, horrified. "Do not stop your vehicle," the operator instructed firmly. "Police are less than 5 minutes away." Jordan increased his speed, attempting to pull ahead of the sedan, but our pursuers matched us effortlessly. For several harrowing moments, we drove parallel at over 80 miles per hour, separated by mere feet of asphalt. Then, without warning, the sedan swerved toward us. "Look out!" I screamed as metal scraped against metal, the impact sending our smaller car veering toward the guardrail. Jordan fought for control, wrestling with the steering wheel as our tires skidded across the lane markers. Somehow he managed to correct our trajectory, narrowly avoiding disaster. The sedan had backed off momentarily, but was already repositioning for another attempt. "They just tried to run us off the road," I reported to the 911 operator, who responded with increased urgency in her own communications. "Officers have visual on your vehicle," she said. "They're approaching from behind. Can you see emergency lights?" I looked back, searching desperately through the sea of headlights. There, far behind but definitely present, were the unmistakable blue and red flashes of police vehicles. "Yes," I confirmed. "I can see them." The sedan's driver must have spotted them too, because suddenly their vehicle accelerated dramatically, cutting across all lanes of traffic toward the nearest exit ramp. "They're running," I told both Jordan and the operator, watching as the silver sedan disappeared down the exit, horns blaring from the cars it had cut off. "Stay on the highway," the operator instructed. "Officers will pursue the suspect vehicle. Others will intercept you for your statement." Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled alongside us, the officer gesturing for Jordan to reduce speed and follow. He complied, guiding our battered Honda to a safe stop on the shoulder, where 2 additional patrol cars soon joined us. As we sat there, engine off, the full weight of what we'd experienced began to settle. Jordan's hands were still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, while in the back seat, Rusty had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled into a tight ball. "They're gone," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "We're safe." The hours that followed exist in my memory as fragmented scenes disconnected from normal time. Police officers asking questions, taking statements. The damaged side of Jordan's Honda being photographed as evidence. Rusty sitting unnaturally still beside Jordan, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. We learned that the silver sedan had been found abandoned at a gas station 3 miles from where they'd exited the highway. The vehicle had been reported stolen 2 days earlier from a rental car company at San Francisco International Airport. The men themselves had vanished. "You're lucky," the lead officer told us as we sat in the back of his cruiser filling out official statements. "We've had 3 similar reports in the last month. Out-of-town visitors followed and eventually robbed or worse. The MO is always the same. They target people who look unfamiliar with the area, often people who are distracted by something, like a new dog," Jordan murmured, his hand automatically reaching to stroke Rusty's fur. The officer nodded. "Exactly. They isolate their targets, follow them to remote locations, and—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing that we didn't need the details spelled out. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll take your statements, get contact information. If we catch these guys, and we will eventually, you might need to testify. And in the meantime," Jordan pressed. The officer's expression softened slightly. "In the meantime, you go home. Be extra aware of your surroundings for a while. These guys have your license plate, so they know you're from Santa Barbara County. But it's extremely unlikely they'd follow you that far." His words were meant to be reassuring, but the implication that our pursuers might have the means and motivation to track us to our hometown sent a fresh wave of fear through me. It was well past midnight when we were finally cleared to continue our journey home. Jordan's car had been deemed safe to drive despite the damage to the passenger side, and we had declined the offer of a police escort to the county line. "I just want to get home," Jordan had explained, and the officers understood. The final leg of our drive passed in relative silence. both of us too emotionally drained for conversation. Rusty slept soundly in the back seat, occasionally twitching as he dreamed of whatever dogs dream about. Hopefully, not the terror of the day's events. As familiar landmarks began to appear, signaling our approach to campus and the apartment we shared, Jordan finally broke the silence. "I keep thinking about what might have happened," he said quietly. "If you hadn't noticed them watching us at the park, if we hadn't gotten away the first time—" "Don't," I cut him off. "We did notice. We did get away." Jordan nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "The officer said there were other victims, people who weren't as lucky. I had no response to that. The knowledge that others had faced what we faced, perhaps without escaping, would haunt me for months to come." We arrived home just before 2 a.m., the campus eerily quiet on a Saturday night. Another sign of the changing times as COVID concerns began to alter social behaviors. Jordan parked in our usual spot, but neither of us moved to exit the car immediately. "Thank you," he said suddenly, turning to face me, "for coming with me today. For seeing what I didn't see. That's what friends are for," I replied, attempting a smile that felt foreign on my face after hours of tension. We gathered our belongings, and Rusty, making our way up to the apartment with the hypervigilance of people forever changed by trauma. Every shadow seemed to harbor potential threats. Every sound demanded investigation. Inside, Jordan set about making Rusty comfortable in his new home, arranging the dog bed he'd purchased weeks ago, filling water and food bowls, quietly establishing a routine that would eventually become normal. I watched this domestic scene unfold with a strange detachment, unable to reconcile its mundanity with the life-threatening situation we had narrowly escaped just hours before. "I'm going to bed," I announced eventually. Exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. "Okay," Jordan nodded. "I might stay up a while longer." Get Rusty settled. As I turned toward my bedroom, he added, "Hey, do you think we should get an alarm system? Maybe some cameras for the apartment?" The question revealed what we both knew but hadn't yet acknowledged. Our sense of safety had been permanently altered. The world outside our door now contained confirmed dangers, not just theoretical ones. "Yes," I agreed without hesitation. "First thing tomorrow." In the days and weeks that followed, we established what Jordan came to call our post-incident protocols. We never went anywhere alone. We installed a comprehensive security system in our apartment, complete with cameras monitoring every entry point. We took different routes to and from campus each day, never establishing predictable patterns. Rusty thrived in his new home, quickly bonding with both of us and revealing himself to be an unexpectedly effective watchdog. His hearing was exceptional. He alerted us to approaching footsteps long before anyone knocked on our door. What had initially been planned as a fostering arrangement became permanent. Neither of us could imagine giving him up after what we'd experienced together. The police called twice in the first month. The first time to inform us that fingerprints found in the abandoned sedan matched those from other crime scenes across 3 states. The second call brought news that similar incidents had ceased since our encounter, suggesting the perpetrators had moved on to different hunting grounds. This information provided little comfort. We knew they were still out there, still targeting vulnerable strangers in unfamiliar places. As March gave way to April, the world's focus shifted entirely to the escalating pandemic. Our university transitioned to remote learning. Our apartment became not just a refuge from specific threats, but from a globally threatening virus as well. In this strange new reality, our hypervigilance almost seemed normal. Everyone was now wary of the outside world. Everyone limited their movements and interactions. Our trauma camouflaged itself within the collective anxiety of a society in crisis. Only in quiet moments, when sleep proved elusive or when passing headlights cast moving shadows across our living room wall, Did the full weight of what we'd experienced resurface? In those moments, Rusty would often appear as if sensing our distress, offering simple canine comfort that somehow helped more than any words could. We never learned who the men were or why they had selected us that day in the park. The uncertainty itself became another form of ongoing trauma, the not knowing, the endless questions without answers. Sometimes I find myself returning to that moment in the park when I first noticed we were being watched. What if I had dismissed my unease as paranoia? What if Jordan had been alone that day? The alternative scenarios multiply endlessly, most ending in outcomes too disturbing to dwell upon. It's been over 2 years now since that March day. Jordan and I still share an apartment, though we've moved to a more secure building farther from campus. Rusty remains a constant, loyal companion. Now fully trained and certified as a therapy dog, Jordan's way of creating something positive from our experience. We've mostly returned to normal lives, whatever normal means in these unprecedented times. We go to classes, see friends, even travel occasionally, though never alone and never without extensive planning. But some changes are permanent. I don't sit with my back to doors in restaurants. Jordan keeps his car in immaculate mechanical condition, never risking breakdown in remote locations. We both maintain awareness of exits wherever we go, and sometimes, when driving on the highway at night, I still check the rearview mirror more often than necessary, searching for a silver sedan that I pray I'll never see again. The authorities never caught them. The case remains open but inactive, just another file in a system overwhelmed by more immediate concerns. Those men, whoever they were, are still out there. I hope they've forgotten us. We certainly haven't forgotten them. This is the reality of surviving instead of becoming a statistic. A news headline, a cautionary tale. The danger passes, but the awareness of vulnerability never truly fades. It becomes part of you, altering how you move through the world, how you assess risk, how you define safety. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard car doors closing outside our building. On those nights, Rusty always senses my fear, pressing his warm body against mine until my breathing steadies. In those moments, I remind myself of what we learned that day. Danger is real, but so is our capacity to recognize it, to act, to survive. And sometimes, that knowledge is enough to make it until morning,